Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Lesson Plan 2.2, 2.1 video. What I'm going to do today is make a couple of brief videos because the lesson for this week, Module 2, is covering 4 sections. So I'm going to combine some comments about 2 sections, and then I'm going to make another brief video to combine comments about 2 other sections so that you don't have to watch one super long video. And the point is for you to use these to supplement our in-class conversation, and it will always also leave us time to engage in some activities in class this week. So this is the lesson plan, and the format will be the same throughout the class. So as you can see here, this is an overview of all the sections we'll cover. This video will cover McLean and Stewart, America's Dilemmas, and LeMay, Basic Concepts of Majority-Minority Relations. So first, when we're thinking about America's Dilemmas, I just wanted to give you some background so that you understand that there were some early scholars that McLean and Stewart were basing their work on. And so they're not the first who have talked about the dilemmas that are running through American government. There's an early scholar named Alexis de Tocqueville, who you should know about if you're going to be taking any other political science classes. He was a French political thinker. And he wrote that Americans are so enamored of equality that they would rather be equal in slavery than unequal in freedom. So this was his way of identifying this dilemma or the tension between the theory or the rhetoric of equality and the practice of inequality that he saw especially exemplified in the practice of slavery. Then further down the line, we have a more recent scholar named Gunnar Myrdal. He was actually Swedish. And in the 1940s, he wrote a book called An American Dilemma. And what he said was that the United States is shaped by what we call an American creed, which emphasizes liberty, equality, justice, etc., etc. However, and this American creed is useful because it can be used to bring different populations together around these ideals. But he also saw that there's a contradiction between this commitment to democratic values and equality and the existence of racial oppression. So he actually called it a moral dilemma for American democracy, and he felt that this was going to be the root of tensions going forward if America didn't address it. So as you can see, these are just a couple of examples of early scholarship upon which the McLean and Stewart scholarship is based. So McLean and Stewart identified 2 dilemmas, and they outlined them in the reading that you had for this week. The first dilemma is the tension between principle and practice. And basically they're talking about the same idea, that in principle, our political system talks about equality, democracy, egalitarianism, and these values are also enshrined in our Constitution. But in practice, America has systematically denied rights and privileges to its own citizens based on race, and it continues to do so. So this is the first tension that we'll be talking about, and it'll carry through the class, so it's important for you to understand. Then moving on to the second dilemma is a question of strategy. So the first one deals with kind of the difference between what we hear as value and what we see in practice. The second is more thinking about, okay, well, what do we do now? And they specifically focus on minority groups. And the question is, what strategy should be used by minority groups in dealing with one another? Coalition or conflict? So they're asking this question, given the fact that we have this first dilemma, the tension between theory and practice, should minority groups be trying to build coalitions, working together, trying to find common ground, or should they kind of fight it out to gain power for themselves at one another's expense? And of course, at different times in history, different groups have chosen different strategies. And the reason that the dilemmas focus on racial minorities is, one good reason is that America has created separate systems of law with regards to Latinos, African Americans, American Indians, and Asian Americans. Or you might also, instead of Latinos, you might prefer Hispanic Americans. So there's a very good reason why the textbook specifically talks about how minority groups should or might want to get along with each other through coalition or kind of fight it out through conflict. And it's because there are some specific points in history where the American government has created policies that make individuals from these groups be considered separate and treated differently. So here are some examples, and I'm not going to read through each of these, but I wanted you to have this information. So I just put in some information about American Indians, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans. And these are just a few examples, but it gives you some information as to what kinds of systems of law have been put in place over time. Each group, though, has been discriminated against in various forms. So if you want to think about education, immigration, voting rights, etc. Now, it's also important to note that many white immigrant groups were also discriminated against, and we will talk about that a little bit more in our next section when we discuss LeMay and this idea of majority, minority groups and how they're created. But it's just important to note that especially non-Protestant European immigrants, people such as Irish, the Poles, and the Italians, they also suffered lots of exclusion. Xenophobic means fear of foreigners or fear of strangers, and other forms of ethnicity-based discrimination. And because of this, or maybe as a result, they were not considered fully white. So we're going to talk about the process of creating whiteness. Let me just get rid of that. The process of creating whiteness in 1 second. But just understand that this process is also linked to the creation of majority and minority groups. So that's an overview of McLean and Stewart's dilemmas. Now, when we move into section 2, LeMay, the basic concepts of majority and minority relations. What you need to understand, first of all, is that the idea of being a majority or a minority group member is often considered being about power and status. It's not just about numbers. So the label of being a part of a majority group or being part of a minority group, that label contains information about the power and the status of individuals in that group. Let me scroll down. Here we are. So a majority group is one that is superordinate in a superordinate/subordinate relationship. So superordinate means on top, subordinate means on the bottom. The majority group would be the one that is higher up or above the minority group if you put them in that kind of relationship. And it means that the majority group possesses political power, economic power, social and cultural power. So there are lots of different forms. This power allows them to attempt to determine the values and the norms of a society, the majority group. It also allows this majority to create public policy that supports them and supports their interests. Now, like I said before, it's important to note that a majority group doesn't necessarily need to be a numerical majority. And one important example is Black people in South Africa, or Black South Africans. They were in the majority in terms of numbers, but they were considered a minority group because of the level of political power and status that they held. In the United States, gender is another good marker, an indication of majority-minority status. Women are considered a minority group, even though it varies, but at this point, they are about 52-53% of the population. So the number of women is high, but the power and status of women in the majority/minority relationship with men is lower. So that's important to keep in mind. Minority groups, if we're thinking about where they stand in the relationship, they would be subordinate. If you're looking at a superordinate and subordinate relationship. Those are two key terms to remember. Superordinate means above, subordinate means below. Minority group would occupy the lower space. So they're viewed as different and therefore subjected to differential treatment. And again, there's the example of Blacks in South Africa and women. Keep in mind that members of a minority group they have access to less power. They also have less secure access to resources, and they're then subjected to lots of physical, legal, and psychological discrimination. And the idea is that if they are different, the degree to which they are different from the majority group, that is used as a rationale or a reason for subjecting them to these different forms of discrimination. Now, also keep in mind when we talk about the creation of groups, whiteness or white people as a group, that was also a creation. So another key idea in this section is that race is socially constructed. So the idea of there being any kind of race, whether it's a white race or a black race or an Asian race, the idea of race is socially constructed, and that means it's created through social and political processes, attitudes, and behaviors. Whiteness is created through these processes as well. So you may have heard of the melting pot metaphor, and the idea that everyone who comes to America, they have the opportunity to basically let go of their past and the culture that they came with and become part of the American culture, the American melting pot. Immigrants, though, if they were able to kind of blend in and let go of the cultural traditions that they brought with them, then they were given a higher priority and they were more likely to be seen as kind of part of the in group, part of the majority group. They were more desirable if they lost those things that made them distinctive that they brought with them from their home countries. And again, this idea of difference equals deficiency, that led to a desire for Anglo conformity. Everyone needed to fit in, and new immigrants kind of had an incentive to try to fit in because then they would have access to the resources, the power, and the status of the majority group. And that group came to be classified as or characterized as white. So there was an open door to immigration, but there are expectations. And this idea that we have American ideals and the good society is, is one that is open to all and that everyone can come in and contribute to. But immigrants were more desirable if they're closer to the Anglo-American way of looking and living. Less desirable the further away they get to that standard that was created. So in class, we'll be doing a think, pair, share activity. I'll be handing out a couple of brief readings, and you'll be able to think more about this concept and to talk about it with your peers. So that concludes video 1 for the first 2 sections of our module. I'm going to conclude, and then you will also be able to find the second video, which covers chapter 1 and chapter 2.